Hello, I'm really glad you're here. On this channel, I share simple, quiet stories about life, love, and the little feelings we all go through. If that sounds like something you enjoy, don't forget to subscribe. Every subscriber gives me a little more encouragement to keep telling these stories. Now, let's begin today's story. The air was thick with the scent of steel and motor oil, clinging to the damp haze of late afternoon. Sunlight streamed through the dust-coated window panes, casting long streaks of burnt orange across the stained concrete floor. In the main hall of Morgan & Sons Steelworks, the last heavy sounds echoed like a farewell between iron and the men who forged it.
Stood at the end of the production line, his hand gripping an old hard hat worn by time. He wasn't wearing it anymore, no need, because the line had stopped. The massive gears, the electric cranes, the red-hot steel rods. Everything had gone still, as if the factory itself was holding its breath.
A metallic clink rang out as the last mechanic lifted his hands from the control board. The whistle marking the end of the shift blared, but this time, no one rushed to leave. The workers stood in silence, gathered in small groups. Some smoked, others stared into the empty air ahead. As if looking for answers, no one dared to say aloud.
Still here, old man.
Yeah, just wanted to see it one last time, while it's still breathing.
Roy let out a quiet chuckle, but his eyes were red.
28 years. Never thought I'd see this day. Damn. We made it through 3 rounds of layoffs. Guess this one's the real thing.
They haven't said it officially.
Don't have to. You seen the engineers been cleaning out their desks like rats leaving a sinking ship.
Carlos nodded. His eyes drifted to a stretch of empty conveyor belt where, day after day, hour after hour, he had poured his strength into raw steel, forging something larger than himself. He didn't know how to do anything else, had never learned. He fled Mexico in 1986, arrived in this town with fake papers and a borrowed name, started with dishwashing, loading trucks until an old machinist brought him into Morgan Steel. "This is America," the man told him. "Work hard, and you'll survive." Carlos had believed him, and he had survived right up to today. In that vast space, the shadows of men slowly thinned out. Carlos remained, his calloused hand brushing against a cold steel beam, as if trying to touch a memory before it vanished. The final light in the hall dimmed as Roy flipped the main breaker. The silence that followed was heavy, like a cry, too deep to voice. By the time Carlos stepped outside, the sky had turned a shade of deep indigo. Early winter chill crept through his coat. He pulled the collar up and walked past the old chain-link fence, where a rusted sign still hung, "We are the backbone of America." The letters, once bold and proud, now eaten away by rain, sun, and time. The factory gate closed behind him with a slow, final click, like someone had just locked away a piece of the past. On his way home, Carlos walked along Main Street, past shop after shop with signs that read, "For rent," "Permanently closed," or worse, no signs at all, just dust and darkness. One small cafe still had its lights on. Inside, an elderly couple sat by the window, hands clasped, eyes locked, like the world outside had nothing to do with them. Carlos paused for a second, then kept walking. In his mind, numbers started to surface: Isabella's wedding costs, next month's rent, the overdue electric bill, and then his biggest fear, no retirement money. He had never thought about retiring because he had never stopped working. But now, with the factory closed, he knew the game was over. Before reaching home, Carlos stopped by an abandoned train station. The rusted tracks lay hidden beneath wild grass. This place used to be the region's main steel delivery hub. Now, nothing. He stepped over the broken wooden fence, resting his hand on a rail as cold as ice.
Been a long time since I heard a train.
He closed his eyes. Somewhere, in the distance of memory, a train whistle echoed. It took him back to his younger days, to nights on the run, to when he and his late wife climbed onto a boxcar in the dark. Crossing borders with nothing but hope, a dream, a gamble, and now that dream was fading, just like this town. The phone in his coat buzzed, a text from Isabella. "Come home early tonight, Dad. I've got a surprise for you." Carlos gave a tired smile and slipped the phone back into his pocket. His daughter always knew how to make things seem lighter, but tonight he had nothing left but weariness and a heart struggling to stay whole in a world quietly falling apart. The little house sat tucked away at the end of Oakwood Street, where the elm trees had already shed most of their leaves. The roof was lined with old grey shingles, and patches of crumbling wall revealed the red brick underneath. But inside, the warm glow of yellow light poured out a kind of light that Carlos had always believed was the only thing in the world that could make him forget the early winter chill outside. He pushed the door open and placed his hard hat on the wooden hook by the entrance. The familiar smell of dinner floated in from the kitchen stew, caramelized onions, baked cornbread, the flavors of memory. He drew in a long breath, as if to steady himself before facing the truth that awaited.
"You're home. I thought you were having drinks with Uncle Roy."
I'm not thirsty tonight.
"Even better. Tonight's special."
Isabella appeared from the kitchen, her dark brown hair tied neatly behind her head, her cream-colored sweater dusted with flour on the sleeves. Her smile lit up the room, as if the world outside had never fallen apart. Carlos looked at his daughter and saw her mother in her eyes, the woman he had lost 15 years ago, leaving behind a little girl and a man who never quite learned how to love with words. On the dining table, everything was set: 2 large plates of steaming stew, a bowl of black bean soup, a basket of golden cornbread, and a bottle of red wine, one he knew his daughter must have saved up to buy.
Are we expecting someone?
No, but there's good news.
Carlos took his seat. Isabella poured them both wine, then sat across from him. She didn't rush to speak, just looked at him, eyes waiting.
So what is it?
Ethan proposed this morning, in his backyard.
Carlos stared at her for a few seconds. His face remained unreadable, as if the words hadn't quite settled. Then something flickered behind his tired eyes, not joy, but a complicated blend of surprise, concern, and a vague, quiet fear.
And you said...
I said yes. Of course I did. I love him. Dad, you know that.
A soft silence settled over the table. Carlos lifted his glass and clinked it gently with hers.
So you're going to be a bride. Congratulations.
You're not upset? Right. I know we've only been together a year.
It's not about time. It's just...
Just what?
Just everything's changing so fast.
Isabella looked at him, her eyes softening.
If Mum were here, she'd be crying right now.
She'd be hugging you, planning everything. The dress, the cake, the invitations.
And you?
I'll do whatever you need me to, as long as you're happy.
Isabella beamed, stood up, and came around the table to hug him. Carlos patted her back gently, trying to keep his hands from shaking. They ate dinner under the soft light. Isabella talked excitedly about wedding plans next spring, a small church ceremony, followed by a backyard reception at Ethan's house. It won't be too expensive. "Dad," she said, "we're paying for most of it ourselves." But Carlos knew better. Even a simple wedding would be a heavy burden on his empty wallet. He nodded, smiled at her stories. But his mind was already drifting. Numbers filled his head: last month's electric bill, this month's medication, and the looming reality of unemployment with no retirement plan. Isabella stood to clear the plates, still chatting the way she always did. She didn't notice how quiet her father had grown, or how his eyes had shifted toward the window, where the night was slowly swallowing the old street outside. When she stepped into the kitchen, Carlos looked down at his hands. Calloused fingers, once bloodied from raw steel, now trembled slightly. A wedding, a new future for his daughter, but maybe also the final note in everything he had ever built under a borrowed name, in a country he was never truly allowed to call his own. And he knew he couldn't let her find that out, not now. The next morning, Carlos woke up earlier than usual. The kitchen clock read 6:10 a.m., but he was already dressed for work-worn boots, dark faded jacket. Outside the window, fog still blanketed the neighborhood, making everything feel like a gray dream unwilling to lift. On the kitchen table, Isabella had left a note. "Don't skip breakfast. Dad, I'm off to school. We'll talk more about the wedding tonight." Carlos folded the note and slipped it into his shirt pocket. He didn't eat breakfast, just poured himself a mug of cold coffee from the night before, took a sip, then stood, grabbed the old bike from the backyard, and quietly rode off into the stillness. The factory was still open, even though the line no longer ran. A small team of workers was dismantling equipment, taking inventory, collecting leftover materials. On the office wall, a new notice had been posted: Retirement Consultation, HR Office, 8 a.m. to 4 p.m. Carlos locked his bike near the curb, walked across the oil-stained lot where weeds poked through the cracks in the concrete. He didn't head toward the production floor. Instead, he turned right toward the office behind the warehouse. That was where the man he needed to see was waiting, the only one who could answer the question Carlos had been avoiding all week. The second-floor hallway was silent, the flickering fluorescent light above blinking like an unsteady heartbeat. The door to Mr. Whitaker's office, head of HR, was slightly ajar. Carlos knocked gently, knocked.
"Come in. Carlos."
Mr. Whitaker was in his 60s, lean, wore rimless glasses, and drank tea instead of coffee. His desk was stacked with files, some cardboard boxes labeled Archive 2002-2010. He looked up with the same polite patience as always, though visibly tired.
I don't mean to bother you. I have some questions about retirement.
"Of course. Have a seat."
Carlos sat on a wooden chair that creaked under his weight, his hands folded together. For a moment, he said nothing.
"I take it you've heard about the pension asset restructuring?"
I heard, and I need to know if I still qualify, because I'm not sure I have enough tax years.
Whitaker nodded, opened a drawer, and pulled out a folder labeled Carlos Valdez. He flipped through the pages, tapped keys on an old keyboard, checked something on the outdated HR system.
"According to the records, you started here in 1997. There's a gap in verified Social Security numbers from 1997 through 2003. Starting in 2004, everything looks more consistent."
So, do I qualify for any pension?
Whitaker looked up, his eyes softening.
"Carlos, I have to be honest. No. You have 16 official tax years. The minimum required to receive basic company retirement is 20. As for federal benefits, they require at least 10 years with a verified Social Security number. You have 8.
Carlos sat still, as if a gust of wind had knocked him off balance. He stared at the tiled floor, his heart pounding slowly, heavily.
I used false papers. Back then, I was scared of being deported. I needed the job. I had a daughter to raise. I didn't have a choice.
I understand, and I'm not here to judge. But the system, it doesn't care. If the requirements aren't met, there's nothing to claim.
The air in the room seemed to thicken. Carlos swallowed, but his throat was dry. His hands clenched on his knees, veins rising.
I can't tell my daughter. She's getting married.
I'm sorry. If there's anything I can,
No, thank you. I just needed to know for sure.
Carlos stood, giving a slight nod. Whitaker rose too, didn't offer a handshake, just placed a hand over his chest in a silent farewell. Carlos walked out without looking back. The hallway on the second floor was empty. Light from the window at the far end cast long shadows beneath his feet, like a spotlight following a man leaving a courtroom. Down there lay the factory that had once been his whole life, and now it was just an empty shell, like his future inside that pension folder. Night fell quickly, like a cold wind slipping through town. The streetlights cast pale yellow streaks across the speckled asphalt, once busy with workers. Now quiet. Almost deserted. Inside the old house at the end of Oakwood Street, everything was still. As if the outside world had come to a halt. Carlos sat alone in the living room, all the lights off except for a small lamp glowing dimly over the scratched wooden table. In his hands was an old wooden box, one corner chipped, the wood darkened with age. He opened the lid, his fingers trembling slightly as he lifted layers of old paper, faded photographs that only he remembered. A small photo slid from the edge of the box. He picked it up, held it under the light. In the picture were two young men, thin, messy-haired, eyes full of fire. One of them was him, nearly 30 years ago. The other was Mateo, his childhood friend from Chiapas, the one who climbed the border fence with him, split the last piece of bread, and vanished into the night after a border patrol chase. Carlos studied Mateo's face, a face not unlike his own, sharp, proud but with wilder eyes, eyes that burned with something dangerous, something untamed. On the back of the photo, a scribbled line in Spanish appeared under the lamp: "If one falls, the other must keep walking." Carlos leaned back in his chair, tilting his head toward the ceiling. The ceiling fan turned slowly, groaning like the ticking of time itself. He couldn't remember the last time he thought about Mateo. Maybe because he tried to forget, tried to lock it all away, but the photo had waited until tonight. He remembered the night they were separated, sirens wailing behind them, Mateo pulling him through a gap in the barbed wire fence, then letting go, sprinting the other way to distract the agents. Carlos ran, didn't look back, didn't dare. That was the night everything changed, the night he lost a friend and traded silence for survival. He had never told Isabella about any of this. To her, he was just the quiet father, reliable, steady. But that silence was a wall that kept the past from bleeding into the present, and now that wall was starting to crack. Carlos placed the photo on the table. His hand reached into the bottom of the box and pulled out an old envelope. No stamp, no name, just one line written by hand: "For the day I'm no longer here." He opened it and read every line again. It was a letter he'd written to Isabella when she was 8, a letter he never gave her. In it, he spoke of her mother, of their escape, of his real name, Alejandro Reyes, a name that had been buried for 30 years. Carlos let out a soft breath and folded the letter, returning it to the box. The lamp cast light across his face, half illuminated, half in shadow, as if he wasn't quite sure who he was anymore. A father? An immigrant? Or just a ghost trying to hold on to a life that had already begun to slip away? Outside, the wind howled against the roof. A cat leapt across the fence, vanishing into the night. Carlos stood, walked to the window, and pulled the curtain aside. In the sky, there were no stars. Only darkness, deep and vast, like a train slowly coming toward him, silent, invisible, unstoppable. That morning, the Pennsylvania sky hung heavy like wet ash. No rain, No sun, just a thick blanket of lead-colored clouds pressing down on the town, making everything feel crushed beneath an invisible weight. Carlos sat alone at the kitchen table, flipping through an old newspaper, though his eyes didn't read a single word. Isabella had left for work early, pinning a note to the fridge. "Don't forget we're trying on dresses this afternoon. Dad." Next to it was a crooked heart doodle, the same language she'd used since elementary school to leave messages for her father. Carlos smiled, but the smile never reached his eyes. The sound of a motorbike stopping outside made him freeze. He stood, stepped onto the porch, and saw a stranger, definitely not the young black mailman who usually did the route. This one wore a baseball cap and a mask, handing over a plain white envelope with no stamp.
"Are you Carlos Valdez?
Yeah,
Someone sent this by hand. No name."
Before Carlos could ask anything more, the man turned, revved the engine, and disappeared down the empty street. Carlos stepped back inside, closed the door, and stared at the envelope. No sender, no return address, just two shaky, handwritten words on the front to an old friend. His heart skipped a beat. That feeling. It had been years. He took a small knife, sliced open the envelope, and pulled out a photograph, black and white, old, showing two young men standing in front of a rusted train car. One of them was Carlos, or rather, Alejandro Reyes back in Chiapas. The other was Mateo Ortega. Carlos's hand trembled. This photo shouldn't exist, not here. The original was locked in a wooden box he hadn't opened in over 2 decades. But this was a different copy, taken from an angle a third person had held this camera. Someone had kept it for nearly 30 years. Tucked inside was a small slip of paper. He hasn't forgotten. He's coming. A chill ran down his spine. Carlos dropped his head into his hands, as if swallowing ice. The memories he'd buried began to rush back. 1986. Chiapas. Alejandro Reyes, then just 23, was a law student. Swept up in rebellion, along with Mateo Ortega, he joined a group protesting the government's seizure of indigenous farmland. At first, it was secret meetings, then marches, then violent protests. One summer night, an attack on a police station left 3 people dead. Carlos hadn't committed the act, but his name made the suspect list, thanks to a confession from someone who'd been caught. Mateo, more radical, more reckless, was the ringleader, but Carlos was branded as an accomplice. The police came after them. With no options left, they fled to the US together, by freight train, across desert, under cover of darkness, near the Texas border, when patrol agents spotted them. Mateo grabbed Carlos and pulled him in the opposite direction. "I'll draw them off, you run." Those were the last words Carlos ever heard from him. Carlos didn't know if Mateo lived or died. For 10 years in America, he didn't dare speak the name. Then he met Lucia, the only person he ever told the truth. She urged him to turn himself in, to apply for political asylum. But Carlos was afraid of extradition to Mexico, where Mateo might have been captured, where his name still lingered on dusty case files. Now Mateo had returned. Carlos stood, opened a cabinet, and took out the wooden box. He placed the 2 photos side by side. One he'd kept for decades, the other had come from him. His eyes settled on Mateo's gaze in the photo, once full of passion, now resurfacing with something else, a haunting shadow. He knew Mateo hadn't sent that message for a friendly reunion. This was a warning or a debt being called in, maybe a grudge for being left behind, maybe a threat. The worst part was Carlos now had a home, a daughter, a life however fragile, all built on a name that wasn't his. If Mateo shattered that, he would lose everything. He folded the slip of paper, placed it back in the envelope, and tucked the whole thing into the bottom drawer of the bookshelf, one no one in the house ever touched. Outside, a distant train whistle echoed. Carlos stepped to the window, looked toward the tracks behind the row of houses, where the fog had begun to lift. He didn't know what the next train would bring, but he knew one thing: the past had found him, and it wasn't knocking to say hello. The afternoon settled gently over the old town like a thin curtain. Pale sunlight filtered through the thick clouds, enough to soften the grey streets, but not enough to warm the hearts of those weighed down by worry. Carlos pedaled slowly toward Main Street, where the sign for Mary's bridal still glowed like it had for the past 30 years, even as neighboring storefronts went dark one by one. Out front, Isabella waited with a hot cup of coffee in her hands, her wine-colored scarf snug around her neck, when she spotted her father. She waved, her smile so radiant it made him pause. She looked so much like her mother, not just in her eyes, but in the way she waited for someone with her whole heart.
Right on time, Dad. I thought I'd be out here 10 minutes like always.
Today's a special occasion.
Ethan's not coming. By the way, we're doing it the traditional way he wants to be surprised on the wedding day.
Carlos nodded. A quiet wave of relief passed through him. He knew he wouldn't have been able to hide his emotions with someone else in the room, even if that someone was his daughter's fiancé. They stepped inside. The bell above the door chimed softly. The scent of new fabric and warm jasmine oil filled the wood-paneled shop. Mary, the owner, emerged from behind the counter, her silver hair pinned with a pearl clip. Her face still kind after all the brides she'd seen through the years.
Hello, sweetheart, Mr. Carlos. I've still got your black coffee if you want it.
Thank you. Mary, haven't changed my taste in decades.
Just like the two of you, unchanged and inseparable.
Mary led Isabella to the fitting area behind a soft white curtain. Carlos sat on the long bench, his gaze falling on an old photo hanging on the wall, a brown-skinned bride in a simple gown standing beside a man in a wrinkled shirt. Lucia, their wedding day. His throat tightened. When Isabella stepped out in the first dress square neckline, cinched waist, soft flowing skirt, Carlos held his breath. For a second, time slipped backward, and he saw Lucia again, standing in the little church in San Antonio, eyes just as bright.
Dad, do I look okay?
Like your mother, like sunlight in the middle of the rain.
She'd probably she'd probably laugh out loud if she heard that.
They laughed, a short laugh but enough to clear the fog around his heart, the one that had wrapped him tight since morning. Isabella tried on 2 more dresses. With each change, she chatted about the wedding, about the songs she was considering, about trimming the guest list to save costs. Carlos listened, nodded, smiled, but in his mind, the image of the unmarked envelope and Mateo's eyes in that black and white photo hovered like a shadow he couldn't shake. When Isabella emerged in the 3rd dress, an off-the-shoulder gown with intricate lace, she lingered in front of the mirror, then turned to her father.
This one's the most expensive, but I think this is the dress.
Then you shouldn't wear anything else.
But Dad...
Don't worry, I'll manage.
But you still haven't found a new job.
I've managed harder things than this, sweetheart.
The young woman stepped forward and hugged him still in her wedding dress. He gently held her shoulders, pushing back the wave of emotion rising in his chest. This was what he could give her: a wedding dress, a memory untouched by the past. At the counter, Carlos discreetly took out his wallet while Isabella looked away. Mary understood. She nodded silently and wrote the deposit receipt by hand, saying nothing. On the way home, Isabella looped her arm through his, excitedly talking about the small backyard reception at Ethan's house, the wedding cake her best friend would bake, and the song for their first dance. Carlos listened to every word, committing them to memory like a man trying to engrave beauty into stone before the storm arrives. But, in the back of his mind, fear sat like a silent passenger, heavy, invisible, and uninvited. The small church nestled behind a row of maple trees near the center of town, where the cobblestone road curved gently like a pause in an old melody. Stained glass windows on the wall cast pale hues of violet and blue onto the tiled floor, swaying with the shadow of leaves outside. Carlos walked slowly up the stone steps, hat in hand, dark coat wrapped tight around his neck. He didn't come here often, only for Christmas, Easter. And that year Lucia was buried after the illness. Since then, the church carried a scent in his memory, part comfort, part loss. Inside, Pastor Jeremiah was tidying up the candle shelves, his tall frame dressed in a grey sweater and dark brown trousers. When he saw Carlos, he looked up and offered a calm smile, the kind that neither insisted nor judged.
I had a feeling I'd see you today.
Did you?
Or maybe it's just an old man's habit sensing worry in those a generation behind.
Carlos gave a faint chuckle and took a seat in the front pew. Jeremiah sat beside him without a word. He knew that waiting was the most important part of his work. Outside, the wind pressed through the stained glass panes, producing a soft whistle between patches of silence.
I got a letter this morning.
From whom?
From the past. From someone I'm not sure I can still call a friend.
Jeremiah said nothing, only tilted his head slightly.
He and I were close back in Mexico, late 1980s. We stood up against the local government land being seized. Farmers pushed out. We protested, wrote papers, pasted flyers. Then there was an explosion. A police officer died, and a child got hurt. I didn't do it, but I was there, and that was enough to be guilty.
You ran.
I fled. By freight train. Him and me, his name was Mateo, when the border patrol spotted us. He stayed behind so I could escape. I thought he was dead. I never saw him again. But now, he's found me.
Jeremiah folded his hands, face solemn, but his eyes held no judgment.
I live under a false name. No citizenship, no pension, nothing legal except a work ethic and the promise I made to my wife that our daughter would live a normal life.
And now the past threatens that.
He sent a photo, said he knows where I am, said he hasn't forgotten.
A wind chime rang from the porch across the street. Someone had opened the souvenir shop. Carlos looked down at his hands, calloused knuckles, faintly trembling in his palms.
I don't know what he wants. Forgiveness, revenge. To pull me back into that old hatred. I'm scared. Not for myself, but for my daughter.
You're not the first to sit here and say that, not the first to carry guilt, and not the first to love someone enough to take on their punishment.
Carlos looked at him, eyes that had witnessed countless funerals, promises, and confessions now offering only one thing to listen.
I didn't come to confess. I came to find a way to protect my family, if anyone could understand that.
I can't promise to protect you legally, but I can promise you won't be alone.
A silence passed. Then Carlos nodded, like a man who'd just set down a stone that had lived in his chest too long.
I'm not asking God to erase the past. I just hope it won't steal the future too.
Jeremiah stood, placing a hand on Carlos's shoulder, giving it a quiet squeeze.
The past is a shadow. If we don't turn around, it can't catch us.
That evening, as the town lights flickered on, Carlos sat alone in the living room. The main lights were off, leaving only the soft amber glow of a desk lamp spilling across the half-read page before him. Isabella had gone to bed, exhausted from the wedding dress fitting and a long call with friends. The house was silent, as if someone had stolen all the sound and left behind only a fine dusting of time. On the table lay the bridal shop invoice, a small notebook tracking expenses, and the white envelope he still hadn't thrown away. Mateo's photo was now in the bookshelf drawer, but its grip on his mind hadn't loosened. He took a deep breath, about to rise and make coffee. When the landline rang, Carlos stared at the phone for a moment before picking up. A woman's voice came through clear, unfamiliar.
Hello, is this Mr. Carlos Valdez?
Yes, this is Carlos.
I'm calling from the Federal Immigration Office, Philadelphia Division. We need to verify some information regarding your citizenship records. Could you confirm your birth name, place of birth, and year of entry?
Carlos froze. Those words, verification, records, place of birth, were the very things he'd spent 3 decades avoiding. Every form he filled, every signature he made, every bank account he opened, he did it like walking a tightrope, knowing one wrong dot could unravel everything.
Why are you calling now?
Our system flagged irregular overlaps between your name and an individual on Mexico's internal watch list. This is standard procedure. Can you visit our office within 7 days for verification?
I need to know what exactly matched.
I'm not authorized to share further details over the phone, but we advise full cooperation. Failure to respond within the time frame may result in escalation to a higher level.
Click. She hung up first. Carlos remained standing, the receiver still in his hand, his heartbeat so loud it almost filled the room. In that moment, everything around him felt unfamiliar. The room, the worn carpet, the photo of Isabella's mother on the wall. Each detail now seemed fractured, fragile. He sat down, breathing hard, loosening the top button of his collar. His hand reached for the wooden box. For the first time in years, he pulled out every document inside his Mexican birth certificate. An old student ID, a copy of the prosecution warrant he never turned in. It was a different world, a different name, now threatening to surface again. Outside the window, the wind picked up in gusts. Carlos stared out at the street, where the lamplight fractured into golden halos on the wet sidewalk. Mateo knew where he was. The immigration office had called. The thing Carlos feared most was no longer a shadow. It was starting to take form. And for the first time in years, a question rose in his chest, one he had never dared to ask. Should he run again? Night fell over the town like a thick grey blanket, heavy, damp draped across its quiet streets. The yellow lights along Fifth Avenue flickered like tired eyes at the end of a long day, not far from the old steel mill. A 24-hour convenience store remained lit, the only halo in a neighborhood slowly dimming window by window. Carlos stood outside the glass doors, wrapped in a grey canvas coat, rubber gloves on his hands, mask pulled low beneath his chin. He had just started the night janitor shift from 10 p.m. to 4 a.m. at this store. No long-term contract, no insurance, but they paid in cash exactly what he needed to patch the hole in the bridal shop deposit. Inside, the store owner, a man of Indian descent named Ravi, handed him the restroom key and a printed list of tasks: mop the floors, wipe the glass doors, take out the trash from the back, clean all shelving units. Ravi spoke quickly, asked no questions, just demanded punctuality and cleanliness.
As long as you work fast. I don't care what you did before.
I just need the extra hours.
Nobody wants this shift. If you can handle it, it's good for both of us.
Carlos nodded without another word. He knew he had no room for choices. The shift began with dragging the mop bucket from the stockroom. The floor was sticky from the earlier rush-spilled coffee. Snack crumbs, wet footprints. He bent down, dipped the rag into a bucket of bleach water, and started wiping from the entrance to the register counter. Every swipe was a new thought about the cake cost, the garden rental deposit, how to keep all of this from his daughter. His hands trembled slightly from the cold. The tile floor was slick with condensation from the AC slippery and biting. His back began to ache after an hour scrubbing the toilets. When he emptied the last trash bag in the alley out back, a piece of broken glass slid from a torn package, slicing deep into the palm of his left hand. Blood soaked through the glove, but Carlos didn't cry out. He peeled off the glove, wrapped his hand in paper towels, then returned inside to finish the last task, cleaning the mirror. In its reflection, he saw his own face darkened, hollowed, aged by 10 years in just 3 weeks. By 4 a.m., he changed out of his coat and quietly exited through the side door. No one said goodbye, no one said thank you. On the walk home, the night wind slapped against his face, sharp as ice. Carlos lowered his head, hand clenched around the makeshift bandage, walking slowly down the empty avenue. When he reached the house, he took off his shoes on the porch, eased the door open so he wouldn't wake Isabella. In the kitchen, he poured himself a glass of water. His hands shook so badly the cup spilled. He sat down at the table and opened his palm. Blood had dried into a rust-colored smear, like a quiet reminder of the price he was paying. On the table was a small note. "Don't forget breakfast. Dad, I'll be home early today," with a tiny, familiar heart doodle beside it. Carlos stared at the note, his lips pressed tight, his eyes reddened, but no tears fell. The man who spent the night cleaning, bearing pain and fear, still held on to one last thing, the tear that hadn't fallen. The next morning, pale sunlight slipped through the thin curtains, casting a soft glow across the wooden floor. Isabella stepped out of her room, hair still tousled, bare feet brushing the cool boards. She yawned and headed to the kitchen, planning to make coffee only to find the kettle had already been boiled. Her father's mug sat on the table, but the coffee inside was cold. He was nowhere to be seen. She tilted her head, listening. No sound from the bedroom, none from the bathroom. A vague unease crept in. Isabella opened her father's door and gently pushed it open. On the bed lay his dark coat, and his knit cap sat askew on the nightstand, but Carlos was gone. She took out her phone and texted, "Where are you, Dad?" No reply. It wasn't until nearly noon that Carlos returned. The door opened softly. He stepped inside, shoulders slumped, eyes sunken and ringed with dark circles. His shirt stained with strange specks of dust. Isabella saw him from the kitchen, coffee in hand, and said nothing at first.
Where were you last night?
I just went out for a bit.
Out at 4 in the morning.
Carlos didn't answer. He started to take off his coat, but Isabella stepped closer and gently tugged his arm. His left hand was crudely wrapped in a paper towel, with dried blood caked between his fingers.
What happened to your hand?
Just scraped it on a cabinet. It's nothing serious.
Scraped it where? Tell me the truth.
He stayed silent, eyes downcast. Isabella frowned, turned into the kitchen, and pulled out the first aid kit from a drawer.
Sit down. Let me clean it.
Carlos sat, palm open. Isabella carefully dabbed away the dried blood, but her eyes never left his face.
What are you doing behind my back?
Nothing. I just wanted to make a little more money for the wedding.
I told you we've got it covered. I don't want you exhausting yourself like this.
You don't understand. I need to.
Need what? To hide things? Carry it all alone? Or leave your daughter guessing every day?
She paused. His hand still rested in hers, colder than usual.
I already lost, Mum. I don't want to lose you too, not while you're disappearing into silence like this.
Carlos looked at his daughter. In her eyes there was no anger, only fear, and in that moment, he saw the cost of every unspoken truth.
I'm not going anywhere. I just want to make sure that day is the most beautiful day of your life.
I don't need a beautiful wedding if it means finding you collapsed in the bathroom from exhaustion.
They fell silent. Isabella finished the bandage, then gently rested his hand on his lap.
Just promise me if things get hard. You'll tell me. I'm your daughter. I'm not 8 anymore.
But to me, you'll always be that little girl I need to shield. Even if it means working 10 extra hours a day, as long as you're happy. That's enough for me.
Isabella gave a bittersweet smile and leaned in to hug him. Carlos closed his eyes. The wound on his hand didn't hurt as much as what ached inside the quiet truth that he couldn't protect his daughter forever by staying silent. Ethan was a young man from a middle-class background, tall, bright-eyed, with a calm voice, a remote software engineer for a company in Boston. He lived in a world of code, data, and clean solutions, but what caught Carlos's attention wasn't his job, it was his humility. Ethan never tried to relate to Isabella's past, nor did he pretend to understand it. He simply listened, showed up when needed, and never left when things got hard. They met at a community education seminar. Isabella was there offering guidance for immigrant families. Ethan had come with his younger sister, who was searching for scholarship opportunities. A short conversation led to longer coffees, and one winter later, he proposed with a simple silver ring, no diamond. Just something that fit Isabella's hand, and her spirit earthy, strong, and full of love. That afternoon, the late sun spilled gently through the living room window. Carlos sat in his old armchair, holding a cup of hot tea Isabella had brewed before she rushed out. He was just about to prop his feet up when 3 short knocks sounded at the door. When he opened it, there stood Ethan, wearing a light sports jacket, holding a paper bag, his calm smile framed by the golden hour light.
Brought some apple turnovers, my mom made them. Isabella said you like desserts that aren't too sweet.
Thanks. Come on in.
Ethan stepped inside and set the bag on the table. The scent of cinnamon and baked apples filled the room, softening the antiseptic smell of bandages and the stale air of age. They sat. Carlos said nothing. Ethan waited a few seconds, then spoke.
Can I ask you something?
Sure.
After the wedding, we're planning to fix up the apartment above the garage. It's small, but enough for 3. If you want, you could stay up there with us.
Carlos looked at him, surprised. His eyes held a trace of caution, as if weighing whether this was politeness or something more. But Ethan's gaze didn't shift, sincere and steady.
Why would you think I need to live with you?
Because I see you're lonely. And I think someone who raised Isabella into the woman she is deserves to be near people who care about him. Not alone.
Carlos was quiet, gently turning the teacup in his hands. He didn't look at Ethan, only at the table, where the sunlight cast soft shadows of the lamp and a small picture frame lying slightly askew.
Thank you, but I don't think I'll be staying much longer.
What do you mean?
There are things from before that need to end before anyone else gets pulled in.
Ethan furrowed his brow. It wasn't the first time he sensed Carlos was hiding something much larger, but this time there was no attempt to mask it with a smile, only fatigue and eyes looking somewhere far away.
If there's anything I can do to help, even if it means keeping quiet, I'm still here.
Some things you make. You clean up yourself. You don't ask others to get their hands dirty for you.
Ethan stood and walked toward the door. Before leaving, he turned back.
The offer's still open, small place, but warm. And no one has to be alone unless they choose to be.
Carlos nodded, trying to smile, but as the door clicked shut behind him, that smile fell with the last light slipping off the porch. In the room, only the ticking of the clock and the cooling tea remained. He knew if the truth about Mateo, the old records, and his real name ever surfaced. Not just him, but Ethan and Isabella would pay the price, and Carlos would never allow that. The clock in the living room read 1:12 a.m. The house was dark, lit only by the faint glow of a hallway nightlight spilling across the old carpet. Carlos lay on the sofa, still fully dressed, one hand resting on his forehead, eyes half closed. He couldn't sleep. Sleep was no longer refuge, it had become a door to endless dreams filled with Mateo's face. Train whistles and the shadows of men in government uniforms. A knock echoed through the silence. 3 knocks, heavy, firm. Carlos sat up straight, heart pounding. He glanced around, no sound from Isabella's room. She was likely still asleep. He crept to the front door and peeked through the curtain slit. 2 plainclothes men stood beside an unmarked car, a faint flashing light tucked beneath the windshield. He opened the door just a crack, just enough for his face to show.
Can I help you?
Are you Carlos Valdez?
Yes.
We're Federal Agents Immigration Investigation Division. We need you to come with us to the station to clarify some information. It won't take long.
At this hour?
We need to verify a few discrepancies in identity records. This isn't an arrest, just a request for cooperation.
Carlos exhaled through his nose. He couldn't refuse, but he also couldn't wake Isabella. If she saw this...
I need to change my coat.
One of the agents nodded. Carlos shut the door, stepped into the bedroom, and pulled his thickest coat from the closet. Before leaving, he scribbled a note and placed it on the table, stepped out for a bit, back soon. The door clicked shut. The car slipped away into the night like a ghost without plates. Inside, Carlos sat between the 2 silent men. Streetlights swept across his face in pale flashes, one by one. No one questioned him further. No one said he was under suspicion, but it was that very silence that choked him. They had files, they knew something, and now they were waiting for him to confirm it. As the car disappeared from the neighborhood, darkness folded behind him like a door he wasn't sure would ever open again. The interrogation room was small, pale beige walls, cold fluorescent light spilling over a stainless steel table. Carlos sat upright, both hands resting on the surface, not cuffed. But he knew the appearance of freedom was just a shell. Everything here was recorded, every motion, every blink. Across from him sat a woman in her early 40s, short hair, light grey blazer, no badge on display, but she spoke like someone familiar with secrets. Her name was Claire Donner, senior investigator with the Office of Immigration and Identity.
You are Carlos Valdez, born 1963 in Puebla, Mexico, entered the United States in 1992 using documents under the name Ricardo Lopez. Am I correct?
Carlos remained silent, his hand clenched lightly into a fist.
We've cross-checked the old records. Your fingerprints match an individual flagged in Mexico's internal watch list during the 1990s. Charges destruction of state property, involvement in armed protest. That individual, Mateo Rios, named you as an accomplice.
Carlos closed his eyes for a second. That name again spoken aloud, like a scar split open.
We found no evidence you participated in violence, but entering the U.S. under a false identity is still a violation of federal law.
I didn't use a false name to hide. I used it to survive.
The problem is you survived by breaking the law.
Carlos lifted his head. His voice was low but steady.
I didn't come here to destroy anything. I came to work. 30 years, no breaks, no crimes. I didn't hide from anyone except my own name.
That doesn't exempt you from consequence.
I understand. All I ask is to choose when it happens. There's a wedding, my daughter's. I just want it to be whole.
Claire studied him for a moment. She wrote something in the file in front of her.
We haven't made a deportation decision yet, but your case will be submitted to the federal court within 30 days. During that time, you may file for review, you might need a lawyer, you might need witnesses, but above all, you'll need honesty.
Carlos gave a faint nod. There was no room left inside him for hope, only duty. He didn't believe he could change anything. He only hoped to delay it.
One last question. The man named Mateo Rios, are you aware he is currently in the U.S.?
I know. He knows where I am, and I don't think he came here to forgive.
Claire wrote one final line, then stood.
You have 30 days.
Carlos remained seated, alone. The lights still shone above him, but inside it felt like he was sinking into deep water where the past no longer whispered like shadows, but roared like a storm. The morning light filtered through the curtains, pale but without warmth. The house was unusually quiet, no sound of boiling coffee, no radio playing softly like it always did when Carlos read the news. Isabella woke with a vague sense of unease, stepped into the hallway in her pajamas, sleep still clinging to her eyes. On the table lay a note, her father's handwriting messy, but familiar, stepped out for a bit, back soon. The clock read 7:15 a.m. By this time, Carlos was usually home, eating breakfast, or, at the very least, answering her texts. Isabella picked up her phone and called him. No answer. She tried again. Still nothing. She opened the front door and looked out onto the dewy street. Her father's car was still parked in the driveway. Her heart pounded. She turned back to the table, where Carlos had once left a bank folder. She opened it. Flipping quickly through the pages, an account balance dropping steadily, and then a letter from the steel mill termination notice due to line restructuring, dated 3 weeks ago. Isabella collapsed into a chair. Her hands trembled. She clutched the letter and read it again and again, hoping she'd misread, but everything was clear. The door creaked open. Carlos stepped inside, holding a gas station coffee. He hadn't expected her to be awake. She was standing at the table, eyes red, the letter from the mill in her hand.
You lost your job 3 weeks ago.
Carlos froze. His hand squeezed the coffee cup until the plastic buckled.
And you said nothing. Pretended you were still going to work. Going where, doing what? Did you think I didn't need to know?
I didn't want you to worry.
Didn't want me to worry. You lied. You let me live in an illusion while you took it all on yourself. Why?
Because that's what I'm supposed to do.
Did you even think how I'd feel finding out I already lost Mum? If I lose my trust in you, who do I have left?
Carlos stepped forward, reaching for her hand, but Isabella pulled back. In her eyes was something deeper than anger. It was heartbreak, not because he lost his job, but because he chose to carry it alone and shut her out.
I just wanted to keep things peaceful, so your wedding wouldn't be shadowed by this.
But your silence is what's casting the shadow.
They stood, facing each other, in a room that had once felt warm, now filled with a quiet distance neither could name. Carlos sank into the chair, and for the first time since his wife's passing, he felt truly too old to hold everything up on his own.
I don't have much time left, Isabella. Not just because of age, but because something's coming for me.
Isabella stepped closer, her voice shaking.
What do you mean?
I mean, if there's ever a day when you wake up and I'm gone, you have to understand everything I did was so you could live a normal life. One not spent running like I did.
Isabella dropped into the chair across from him. She began to realize this wasn't just about losing a job. Something much bigger, much more dangerous, and far more painful was buried beneath.
Who are you really? Dad.
Carlos didn't answer. He only looked down, hands clenched like he was holding on to one last truth he couldn't yet speak. and inside him. A door called truth had begun to open a door he knew, once passed through, would never lead him back to being just a father again. The afternoon hung over the town in a weary shade of gold. Outside a small cafe near the southern gas station, Carlos sat alone in a quiet corner of the patio, out of sight, out of mind. He chose this place because it was tucked away, rarely visited by familiar faces, and, more importantly, close to the highway. A knot in his gut told him today wouldn't be like the others. An old ocean blue pickup pulled quietly to the curb, the engine cut off, and the door creaked open. A man stepped out, tall, lean, walking with a slight limp as if an old injury still haunted his right side. He wore a worn-out brown leather jacket, the collar creased and dusty, and a sun-faded baseball cap pulled low over his weathered brow. His face looked carved from stone-sharp bones. Desert-tanned skin, but it was his eyes that truly marked him, dark hollows, filled with shadows and years the world had forgotten. It was Mateo Rios. Once. He had been a comrade in arms, a brother in the resistance, the one who'd run the opposite way to distract the border patrol so the others could cross the desert. The man who had drawn fire so Carlos could slip past the dead lands. Now he returned not as a savior, but as a walking memory come to collect a debt. He didn't scan the crowd, didn't search for a seat. He walked straight to the table where Carlos sat, as if the path had been carved 30 years ago.
You got old.
I'm still alive.
Mateo sat down without being asked. His hand rested on the weathered wooden table, quietly measuring the distance between them in silence and memory.
You know how long I've been looking for you?
I knew you'd come. I just didn't know when.
I spent 12 years in prison. While you lived here, new name, new house, curly-haired daughter, and a clean little life.
I survived. I didn't live clean.
Clean is one thing, betrayal is another.
Carlos's hand tightened around the cold coffee cup.
I didn't betray anyone. I pulled out to save lives.
You pulled out without a word. The night before the raid, you left me, Luis, Manuel, and 6 others behind. You know what happened. Luis took 2 bullets to the leg. Manuel never walked out of that camp.
I got word there was a mole. I didn't know who. I pulled out to give you all a chance. I prayed at least one of you would survive.
And the cost of that was my life. 12 years of no name. Of prison guards calling me the abandoned.
Carlos looked straight at him.
I didn't run to save myself. I ran to hold on to the only thing I had left, my daughter.
A breeze swept through, stirring the dust along the roadside. Mateo stayed still, eyes drifting toward the horizon. Then he exhaled, voice lower now.
Does she know who you are?
Not yet. But she will. I can't hide it forever.
Then tell her, before someone else tells her for you.
Mateo rose. His face no longer held anger, only emptiness.
I didn't come to kill you. I don't have to. Life already did the job.
He walked to the truck. Just before climbing in, he turned back.
I used to think you were the last person I could trust. Maybe part of me still wants to, but all I remember is your shadow disappearing into the night. And sometimes you should know shadows don't run forever.
The truck rolled off, tires crunching over gravel. Carlos remained seated, hand still wrapped around the cold coffee. His chest felt heavy, like he'd just lived through a different life, all over again. Night blanketed the town, like a heavy, cold quilt. Carlos's small house sat still in the dark, lit only by the warm pool of a desk lamp in the corner of the living room. At an old wooden table, Carlos sat alone, back slightly hunched, calloused fingers gripping a pen. He turned to the last page of a worn leather notebook, one he had never dared to write on. The lamp glinted on his glasses, casting a pale blur. The page was blank, but the words had been waiting inside him for years.
Isabella, if you're reading this, it means I no longer had the chance or the courage to tell you in person. There's a truth I've kept hidden for over 30 years, not because you didn't deserve to know, but because I was afraid that once you did, you'd never see me the same again. My real name is Gabriel Mendez. I was born in Puebla, Mexico. I was once a med student and a believer in protest. In 1989, a crackdown happened. My group was hunted. That night, a few of us tried to flee. One of them was Mateo, the man you met not long ago. He created a diversion, took the risk, so I could escape. But making it to America didn't mean finding peace. I used someone else's name, started from nothing with empty hands and a heart full of debt. Then your mother walked into my life like the first sunlight after years of shadows. And soon after, you were born. From that moment, I didn't live for myself. Every overtime shift, every skipped meal, every time I kept my mouth shut when it burned to speak was so you could have a real name, a real school, a real chance to love and be loved. I'm no hero. I won't pretend I was right. But if I had to do it again, I'd still choose to run, to hide my name, to live quietly, as long as you could grow up in the light. Now Mateo has returned. The government knows. The truth no longer sleeps. And I don't know if I still have time to shield you from what's coming. But know this, no matter what they call me, no matter what they dig up, you will always be the one thing I got right, if you can. Forgive me, not because I deserve it, but because my love for you has always been real. Love. Dad.
Carlos set down the pen. He exhaled, as if lifting a stone that had pressed on his chest for decades. He folded the letter, slid it into an envelope, and placed it in a drawer beside an old photo of him and Isabella's mother, taken in El Paso long ago, their eyes still full of hope for tomorrow. Outside, the wind rustled beneath the awning. The clock ticked in the quiet, like a countdown. Carlos leaned back, closed his eyes, and for the first time in years let the tears fall without fear, because at last he had spoken his truth. The sky that day was a strange, perfect blue, no clouds, no summer rain. The backyard of the little church at the edge of town bloomed like a June painting. Yellow string lights curled around wood beams, white cloth draped over chairs, sprigs of lavender lining the aisle. The townspeople came in droves, carrying laughter, cream-colored dresses, striped ties, and vintage cameras. Isabella stood in the church's dressing room. Sunlight poured through the window, making her gown shimmer like sea foam. She stared at herself in the mirror, hands trembling not from nerves, but from a restlessness she couldn't name. For 3 days now, her father had been distant, quiet. And this morning, he hadn't eaten breakfast, just left a note. "See you at the altar." Ethan stood by Pastor Jeremiah, adjusting his tie, scanning the seats. He saw friends, family, co-workers, but not Carlos. Then, as the music began, Carlos appeared from the back aisle, wearing his old suit freshly pressed, grey tie, shoes slightly scuffed at the heel. Carlos saw his daughter and lost his breath, not because she looked beautiful, but because she looked whole, something he had only dared to dream of for 3 decades.
You look radiant.
You made it.
I promised.
They walked the petal-strewn aisle hand in hand. Guests rose, cameras clicked, Sunlight danced between them, but in Carlos's chest, each step felt like crossing a bridge with no way back. At the altar, he placed Isabella's hand in Ethan's, gentle, solemn. Their eyes met. No words, but enough was said. Ethan nodded. Carlos nodded back. The ceremony began. Vows rose beneath the open sky. Isabella and Ethan looked at each other with the gaze of two people who knew this was right. Promises through health, through hardship, through hope carried into the hush. Everyone smiled. Everyone felt something stir. And at the far end of the gravel lot, a black car pulled in. Two men stepped out. Plain clothes, sunglasses. They didn't speak, didn't enter, just leaned on the car like men who weren't invited, but had a reason to wait. Carlos saw them, wasn't sure, but something inside him clenched. His breath slowed. He didn't know who they were, but he knew if there were ever a time to say goodbye, it was after the wedding. As the recessional played, guests stood to leave. Ethan wrapped his arms around Isabella. Carlos quietly slipped away from the center, toward a lone tree near the grass. He stood there, as if trying to carve her image into memory, his daughter. In white. In sunlight. Isabella saw him. She let go of Ethan and followed. Carlos heard the soft rustle of her dress in the grass, turned, and tried to hide the welling in his eyes.
Dad, are you okay?
I've never seen you more beautiful.
Then why do you look like you're about to leave?
He said nothing, then pulled a pale, blue-trimmed envelope from his breast pocket.
I have something for the day you need to understand.
What is it?
A story of a father who made mistakes, but never once stopped loving you right.
Isabella held the envelope, starting to open it, but he gently shook his head.
Not today.
She looked at him, longer this time, as if her heart knew but refused to believe.
You're staying, right?
As long as I'm allowed. But if a day comes when I must go, know that I lived for you.
He brushed her hair gently, then turned to leave. Isabella stood still, letter in hand, eyes following his silhouette between the emptying rows of chairs. 3 days after the wedding, the small house returned to its quiet self. The string lights still hung outside the porch. A few flower petals lingered on the steps. But inside, something had changed. Something had. Isabella sat alone in the living room. The envelope still lay on the table untouched, just as her father had given it to her. She had meant to read it that same day, then changed her mind, meant to open it the next morning, then tucked it away again. But that morning, as Ethan left for work, sunlight angled through the glass door, landing squarely on the paper's edge, like a whisper. No more reason to delay. She opened the letter, read each line, each word, each breath held between the ink strokes of a father she'd always thought was quiet and simple. And now every word reflected 30 years of a man who had never lived under his real name, but lived truthfully in every other way. When she reached the line, I crossed the border just to survive. But when you were born, I understood the real reason. You are what kept me standing. Isabella lowered the letter, burying her face in her hands. She didn't know if the tears were for sorrow or for love. At that moment, a knock at the door. A postal worker handed her a thick envelope marked from the Department of Homeland Security. Isabella signed with a pounding heart. She didn't open it, just set it on the table, then ran to her father's room. Carlos stood before the small altar to her mother, hands clasped, lips moving silently. He didn't turn when she entered.
It's true. All of it.
He nodded gently.
I didn't want you to find out this way, but I couldn't let you walk into marriage with a lie standing beside you.
I don't need perfect words. I just need the truth.
She sat beside him.
So, what happens next?
I've been summoned. 7 days from now.
Is there anyone who can help?
Maybe not, but I'm not afraid for myself.
He paused.
I only fear that you'll have to carry this fracture for the rest of your life.
If I know the truth and still call you Dad, then nothing is broken.
Silence settled between them. It was the first time in years they sat quietly, not from a lack of words, but from understanding too much to need them. In the days that followed, Isabella quietly called Pastor Jeremiah. She told him everything, then reached out to Matteo using the number he once left in her father's notebook. She told Ethan, too, and he held her hand without speaking, just sat beside her through the night. One afternoon, Carlos returned from the post office with a folder of documents. When he stepped onto the porch, Matteo was there sitting on the steps, like he'd never left town. They didn't shake hands, just sat side by side, like two shadows sharing a sunset no longer young. Matteo spoke of the years in prison. Carlos listened. When Matteo said,
"Maybe I shouldn't live forever inside the past. If there's one thing I can still do, it's help you hold on to what you've been living for."
Carlos gripped his friend's shoulder for the first time in 30 years. A quiet peace settled in his chest. That day, the sky was covered in thin clouds. It didn't rain, but the light was too dim for anyone to believe this was just a normal day. The Federal Immigration Courthouse in downtown Harrisburg, Pennsylvania, was a pale gray building with frosted windows and unarmed guards. Carlos wore a white shirt, gray trousers, and the same scuffed shoes he had worn to his daughter's wedding. In his hands, handwritten letters, work history, family photos. Isabella sat beside him, never letting go of his hand. Ethan drove them silently, but when they arrived, he placed a hand on Carlos's shoulder.
No matter what happens, you're still part of this family.
The courtroom was small. A few rows of benches, a middle-aged federal judge presided, stern-faced, but not unkind. An immigration officer presented the charges: false identity, illegal residency, failure to declare immigration history. Carlos stood alone, no lawyer, only himself.
I don't dispute what's been said, but I ask to tell the part that isn't in the file. I am Gabriel Mendez. I fled Mexico not to seek riches, but to avoid being disappeared for speaking out against the government. I entered the U.S. under a different name, not to deceive, but because I had no other choice. For 30 years, I've worked without pause. I've caused no harm. I haven't hidden from responsibility. I contributed to this country in the only way I could, through labor and silence.
Isabella rose, asking to testify. She spoke of a father who held 2 jobs, who never came home before 10 p.m., a man who refused to buy himself new clothes for 5 years so he could pay her tuition.
If he's deported, I don't just lose a father. This country loses a good man.
Pastor Jeremiah followed. He spoke of Carlos repairing the church roof for free, delivering aid to the poor, helping the homeless. Finally, Matteo stood. Every word from him gripped the room in silence.
"In my youth, I believed I was right to fight the government, and I believed Carlos abandoned me. But the truth is, he survived, and now I stand to give him a chance to finally live under his real name."
The judge sat in silence for a long while. He opened the file, flipped through its pages, then looked up at Carlos. The law is the law, but justice is something wider than the words on a page, based on your records, your time in this country, and the testimony presented. I am transferring this case to the Humanitarian Pardon Review. All deportation proceedings are hereby suspended until a final decision is made. Carlos didn't cry. He simply bowed his head, but his shoulders loosened as if, for the first time in his life, he could finally breathe. When they stepped out of the courthouse, Sunlight broke through the clouds. No one spoke. Ethan held out the car keys.
You drive.
Carlos smiled, for the first time in years. He walked toward the driver's seat, no longer steering a borrowed life. The sky was pale grey, no rain, but the wind was sharp enough to make those waiting outside the federal immigration court pull their coats tighter. The building, 3 stories tall, stood quietly among the city's administrative blocks, a concrete monolith in a world full of voices. Ethan pulled up and stepped out first. He opened the door for Isabella, then circled to help Carlos out from the other side. The older man adjusted his collar, his gaze steady, not proud, not bowed.
You ready?
No one's ready when they don't know what's waiting.
But no one's alone when someone walks beside them.
Ethan gave Carlos a light pat on the back, then nodded to Isabella. Together. The 3 of them stepped through the courthouse doors. Inside the hearing room, the air was tight as a drawn string. The judge, a grey-haired woman, sat behind a high wooden bench. To her left was the immigration officer. Carlos sat alone to the right, no lawyer. Behind him, Isabella and Ethan, along with Pastor Jeremiah and Mateo, who slipped in quietly, one after another. The officer laid out the charges: illegal residency, use of false identity, failure to disclose prior records, words Carlos had heard echo in his head for most of his life. When it was his turn to speak, Carlos stood. His voice was low but firm.
I don't deny the facts. I did come here under someone else's name, but for over 30 years, I haven't run from a single responsibility, not to my family, not to my work, not to my community. I'm not asking for forgiveness. I'm only asking to be seen as a person, not a number on a form.
The judge nodded, then invited witnesses. Isabella stepped up first. Her hands trembled, but her eyes were steady.
I'm his daughter. I know I'm an American because I was born here. But I became human because I was raised by him. If my father doesn't deserve to stay, I don't know who ever could.
Pastor Jeremiah followed, speaking of Carlos's quiet acts of service, not with words, but with hands and heart. Mateo rose last. His voice was rough, like stone worn down by rain.
I once thought he betrayed us, but now I know he survived. And if I don't stand here today to say that, I'd be betraying what's left of myself.
The room felt tighter than ever, and then unexpectedly Ethan asked to speak. All heads turned toward him, a white, American-born man, stepping forward without prompting.
I'm his son-in-law, and I say this not just for my family, but for this country. We can't demand perfection from immigrants just to admit they're good people. If living with decency isn't enough, then the law is asking for something it can never give in return.
The judge sat in silence. She looked at each of them in turn, then returned to the file, flipping a few more pages. This case will be reviewed over the next 30 days for a final ruling. In the meantime, the defendant is granted temporary stay of removal. This hearing is adjourned. Carlos didn't exhale. He didn't smile. He only turned to see Isabella and Ethan standing hand in hand. Mateo gave him a nod. Pastor Jeremiah touched his shoulder in quiet blessing. Outside, the sky was still grey, but a few rays of sunlight broke through the clouds.
It's still uncertain, but at least it's not over.
Sometimes, not over is already a beginning.
The afternoon light thinned softly, stretching across the roof like a silk ribbon. Wind slipped through the wooden fence, carrying the faint scent of late-blooming roses by the kitchen window. The small house sat still, like a quiet witness that had seen more than its walls could ever tell. Carlos sat on the porch in an old wooden chair, a half-finished cup of cold coffee in hand. He wore a faded knit sweater, the fabric worn thin at the cuffs. No call from the court, no letter in the mailbox that morning, and no one had said anything for sure. But Carlos wasn't waiting for a miracle. He simply listened. The flutter of birds on the power line, the hush of grass under the breeze, the sound of Isabella's footsteps coming from the kitchen door.
You're drinking cold coffee again.
Cold, but familiar.
It's a beautiful day.
Yeah, maybe the most beautiful one in years.
Isabella sat beside him. She placed a small Polaroid camera on her lap.
Ethan said, maybe we should take a picture. For today. Not because something special happened, but maybe that's when you should take one.
Where do you want to sit?
Here, okay.
Carlos nodded. He straightened his back and gently brushed down the silver strands by his ears. Isabella set the camera on the windowsill, adjusted the angle. Ethan stepped out from inside, holding a glass of water, smiling softly.
I figured I'd stand behind, keep the frame balanced.
No, I want all three of us side by side. No one behind anyone.
They sat together on the porch bench. Isabella pressed the shutter. The soft click echoed like the closing of one door and the quiet opening of another. The photo slid out. Isabella held it, waiting for the image to appear. 3 faces, one older, one younger, one in between, took shape in the square frame. No one grinned wide, but their eyes had softened like. For one quiet moment, all 3 were looking toward the same place, a place without fear. Carlos leaned back, eyelids falling shut. He didn't know how long he'd sit here. A week, a month, forever. But right now, in this calm, weightless second, he didn't need to know. Thank you for listening to the story. If you have any thoughts, feel free to share them in the comments below. I'd love to hear from you. Once again, I'm really happy to have you here. Don't forget to subscribe so we can keep sharing more stories about life together. Take care and see you next time.